G'day everyone, and welcome to the Athenaeum Theatre. I'm Benjamin Law. It's a really big privilege to be here with you all tonight, courtesy of the Wheeler Centre. And it's also great to be here with you on Wurundjeri land. First Nations Australians, like the Wurundjeri of the great Kulin Nation where we are now, have been making art and sharing stories and exchanging information for tens of thousands of years. And together they constitute the oldest surviving and thriving civilization on this planet. I'm especially grateful to elders past and present that we can continue telling stories here on what is and what will always be Aboriginal land. Now, our guest tonight is the author of the story collection How It Was For Me and 5 novels, including The Path of Minor Planets, The Story of a Marriage, The Confessions of Max Tivoli, and The Impossible Lives of Greta Wells. He's also the author of one of my favourite novels in recent years. I used to be a bookseller, so I'm just going to do some branding. And I know you're here because it's one of your favourites too. Les is the story of Arthur Les, who discovers his former partner of almost a decade has announced his upcoming nuptials to another man on the eve of Les's 50th birthday. And so in an attempt to outrun his anguish, Les cobbles together an international hodgepodge of literary invitations that takes him around the world. It's funny, it's tender, it's heart-bruising, it's pretty life-affirming. And it also won, of course, the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, the committee of which called it a generous book, musical in its prose, expansive in its structure and range, about growing older and the nature of love. Don't think any of us could have said it better ourselves. So please join me in welcoming the author to Melbourne, Andrew Sean Greer. Andrew, I want to start off by talking about literature, but can I just say that is an amazing outfit? And can you lead us through what you're wearing at the moment? Because there is like amazingness going on.
There's a lot going on.
Okay, like the pants have shine. Where'd you get the pants from?
I got these leather pants made for me in Paris.
First of all, they are real leather. Second of all, you got them made for you
leather.
And this
stretch leather.
And this coat.
This is crazy. Okay, this was like at a crazy moment. After I learned I'd won the Pulitzer Prize, I was in Italy, and I was online shopping a lot afterwards. I bought myself a bunch of stuff because I'm like, I'm gonna have a different life. It's gonna be a life where I wear like things like this. And so I'm like, you better wear that.
Yeah.
Like,
so just to clarify, this isn't the suit that you wore when you received the Pulitzer Prize, because that suit's since become quite famous.
I almost wore it.
Okay.
Thank God, it was the color of this chair. I would have vanished.
You could have just been camouflage. I bring up your fashion because you recently wrote for Vogue magazine about your clothes and about your dress style. You also wrote about the dress sense you had as a kid growing up in suburban Maryland. Can you tell us how you described your dress style back then?
Back then was bland. Incredibly bland, because I grew up in a very bland part of the United States, the eastern seaboard, in a state, Maryland, whose I think I wrote in the article that its state anthem is a Christmas carol.
It sounds like a Christmas carol.
No, it is.
It's an actual Christmas carol.
It's O Tannenbaum, but it's O Maryland, my Maryland. I mean, it's a state without much imagination.
Wow.
I don't think about it when it's not around. And it never is.
I remember you reading that in your maybe late tweens, early 20s, that you dressed like a virgin. That's a line that's really stayed with me.
Yeah, no, that is totally what it was. It was like a big sweatshirt with my college on it, and like pants to here, and I think I got like Converse All-Stars, and I wrote poetry all over them. And I was like 19, you know.
And you write about how your mother was quite a practical dresser because both of your parents came from a science background,
yes,
not like an arts background. Is that right?
Right. She was a very, very practical dresser.
And so where did books fit into your childhood in that kind of household?
They loved books. They love books so much because they came from rural communities in the American South that were very conservative, and books were their window into some other world. And for my father, he taught himself German from his father's German phrase book from World War II, If You Fell Behind Enemy Lines. Wow. That phrase book. And my mother taught herself chemistry from books from the library, and she would poison the frogs in the backyard. And the first time alcohol had ever been in my grandparents' house was when my mother brought ethyl alcohol in for an experiment, and it was scandalous.
Okay, so...
It was a science joke. It didn't go over very well.
No. But I'm also wondering, like, in those kinds of the books that you're talking about, they don't really necessarily sound like literature. Like, did you have stories?
You're right. I know that for certainly for my mother, books of fiction were more important. Mm-hmm. They were some vision of another way of being, not the one she was growing up in. Because she grew up thinking, like, I don't belong here, and I don't understand. And I wish I could really remember her favorite fiction from the 40s and 50s. We'd have to call her.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it was her way out. You know, she got scholarships to go in America where school isn't free, so you have to get scholarships. And you know, she became an experimental physicist. Chemist, physical chemist. And she always told me that at one point in university, she had to decide whether she was going to be an English major or a chemistry major. And she decided on chemistry because it was so easy, and anybody could do it, whereas English, you really had to have a special talent.
Okay, so did you grow up with that kind of attitude that she was passing on to you?
Yeah, she must have passed it down. And we had, like, huge bookshelves of all kinds of fiction, and in with my brother and I, we had our kids' books in with all of their other books, so we would sort of move out of them and look at what they had, and they placed no barrier between what was kids and adult fiction.
And were you always a big reader? What were you reading when you were growing up?
You know, I read, Wizard of Oz books, or I had a strangely British collection of books for an American. It was very Enid Blyton kind of
yes, like Dick
stuff.
and Fanny.
Yeah. That's not normal for Americans. We had, or like Five Little Peppers and How They Grew was a book I recall.
Okay.
I think that's very American.
So at what stage did you want to be a writer, and why?
I wanted to be a writer when I was 10. I remember there was like an assignment for school where we had to write a book, which was probably like 8-10 pages. And I remember typing it out on my parents' typewriter, and it was Imitation of Watership Down, which I had read. It was with squirrels. I wish I knew the title. I think it was called Theodore.
Okay.
That's the name of the. And I loved doing it. I illustrated it myself. I was going to say, like, I hired an illustrator. It was illustrated by the author. My teacher loved it. And so then I started secretly writing whatever a short story is to an 11-year-old, 12-year-old. I wanted, I loved books so much that I wanted to participate. It was like a fan fiction feeling. I wanted to be part of it. And so books I loved, I would want more of them, and I would imitate them in some way.
And what, did you start writing and simply never stopped from then on?
I guess, yeah. I guess so. Yeah, I wrote short stories, and then I would write secret things I'd never spoken of before, like musicals. I wrote musicals.
Oh my God. Okay, so just pause. We're going to lean into this part of the conversation. So, what kind of musicals were you writing?
Can we talk about the fashion again? The fashion?
No, but just like, can you remember anything that you want? Like, what were the elements? Did you write? So you illustrated your own work. Did you write your own songs?
Of course I did. I didn't hire a composer
and
at 12.
You sang before the beautiful anthem of Maryland. Can you sing us anything that you wrote then?
No. Good try. It was. A glass and a half of wine before, and a little Xanax, I had a keyboard, that's what's in my hands right now, that I would like, I would play out songs that were like bad imitations of other songs somehow, but they would be, I think I wrote a musical about like computers. At one point, I wrote another one that was like about nuns. It was very serious. I just cannot recall the songs. It's lost to me.
Oh, how sad. They might come out later at the signing desk if you buy the book. So I've read that during every book that you write now, as a published author, you have a bit of a nervous breakdown with each one.
Does it happen to you? It
Yes.
doesn't. Okay.
Yes, it does. We can compare notes later.
All right.
I'm wondering how do your breakdowns manifest?
Oh, well, they're often at different stages of the writing process. They will be, the typical, I think, is for it to be about 2/3 of the way through. I mean, I don't know it's 2/3 of the way through because it seems like it's failure.
I've heard this from, I haven't written novels, but I've heard this from my friends who write novels, that it's often the 2/3 mark where the stakes feel really high and everyone that I know has written a novel kind of freaks out around then. What is it about the 2/3 mark?
It's nowhere near what you thought it was going to be. And it's completely fails. And what secretly has happened is that the book is on its own course somewhere, and you have to get a sense of that new book it's become and commit to it. But their first, for me, happens to be like a long sort of ancient Greek grieving process for the old book. And the form it takes is me lying on my couch like this for like a week or two. Like, it's stupid.
I mean, I know that you say that it sounds stupid, but what you just did looked really elegant for a breakdown to me. This whole idea that you start having second thoughts about what you're writing because it wasn't what you originally planned. With a novel like this, what was the original plan?
The original plan was for it to be a serious, wistful, poignant rewriting of Colette's novella Chérie
Okay.
with gay men.
Where did that idea come from?
What? I don't know. It seemed like a good idea.
For those of us who haven't read Colette Chérie, me, what is that book?
I will let you know.
Why did it resonate with you?
You do have a pleasure ahead of you, and
Okay.
do not see the Michelle Pfeiffer movie. It's sad. Here's the thing. Colette was a genius of the early 20th century. What she did was extraordinary and contentious, and she wrote about women in a way no one ever written about before, and about female sexuality. And this novel is about a 53-year-old courtesan, Leia, who is dallying with a 20-year-old who is the son of her great rival in their old days as courtesans. And he announces to her that he's going to get married. And she's like, well, good luck to you. Wonderful. I'm going to be traveling abroad. And she does travel abroad. And they hear about all these scandals. And when she returns back, he shows up at her doorstep. And there's an incredibly beautiful, very sad scene of the two of them that goes on for a long time that I won't spoil. But you can see my novel, you can see.
Yeah, I was just about to say, with less, for those of us who have read it, we're starting to hear the echoes of the kind of original inspiration. Then at 2/3 of writing that version of the story, what changes?
It was shit.
Okay.
It was shit.
Can you be more specific?
I was being filmed, I'm sorry. I could not feel sorry for. I had made Leia into a middle-aged gay man, and I couldn't feel sorry for him.
Right.
The way Colette felt for Leia, and there's because it's a completely different situation. He's in a position of greater privilege and status, and I just kept thinking, stop whining. I couldn't find a way into, although he was very much like me. Less like me than this version, strangely. Like, he didn't look like me. He wasn't a writer, I don't think. And one day I was so desperate with the pages I had written. I was swimming in the San Francisco Bay, and which is a numbing, meditative experience. And I just thought, well, I think I'm just ridicule him instead, because I can't stand him.
Okay.
Yeah.
And and that was the key change. That was the
Yeah.
key to making less.
And
what
I
it is
started
now.
all over I started from the travels, the idea from Cherie of that she goes abroad. I thought, well, what if I just do that part?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we've heard before that one of the mission statements behind this book was to really capture joy and comedy. And in writing that kind of book, I guess one of the fundamental challenges I imagine is to be able to do something that's funny and joyous in a way that's not sentimental and syrupy. So how do you navigate that in writing a book that is very much adamantly not those things?
Well, I mean, that was the real challenge, because I think that's the hard part. I feel like by ridiculing him, it wasn't becoming sentimental, because it wasn't, you just kept being like, ouch, ooh, ah, he seemed like a fool. So it didn't seem as much like a romance in some way, because he seemed anti-heroic. And I was trying to tear things away from him and leave him with not nothing, but with very little of his dignity intact, so that I could reward him.
Yeah.
Because my idea, once I'd remade it, or rethought it in my head, I remembered a conversation with a great student of mine, who's also a great writer, and we were drinking one night, and he said, you can't write a novel about joy. And I was like, of course you can. There's no rules in writing. You can write about anything. He's like, no, you can't write a novel about joy, because it doesn't go anywhere. You start, you just joy all the time, or where's the joy? Like, how does it happen? And I said, I just know I can do it. And so it felt like I had written poignant, wistful novels with bittersweet endings before. And it was a little bit of a challenge to me to see, could I do another kind of feeling?
And then, I mean, all of this makes me think of when I used to work in a bookshop. I remember there was this one customer who asked me, what is your recommendation for a book that is literary and sophisticated and will actually leave me smiling and isn't sentimental? And this was before Les came out, and I couldn't think of a book. I found that task really, really difficult.
Can you think of any now?
Well, yes, I can.
I just set it up.
But I also wonder, am I just imagining this? Was my bookshop just heavily swinging towards really depressing literature? Or is there kind of a disjoint between what people consider to be serious literature and its capacity to be joyous and entertaining and funny?
There is a funny, I mean, I think so many of the great writers, especially in the English language that we think of, have written in a comic mode as well as more as tragic or bittersweet. Graham Greene would go all over the place, and his Travels with My Aunt is a book that I think of as being joyous in some way, although that is a cynical, bitter man and problematic in his way of writing about the world. But the book just feels that he had great fun, and he called it an entertainment, not one of his major works, and so he was able to pull off something that's so rare. But I think, at least for Americans, that writers like Updike and Roth, who we see as these great, and now they've been toppled a little bit, but they were comic writers most of the time, in the sense that they played with language in a funny way instead of a pompous way. They were certainly capable of pomposity, but you could tell that there was some joy in the language that comes across.
So, look, there's something so delicious about the premise itself, and early on you capture this kind of giddy thrill of being anonymous in a big city. I'll give you my copy. I hope I've got it in the right place. There's this beautiful, is that the section that you wanted to?
I'm sure it is.
Natural segue, people. So you capture this thrill about finding yourself alone in a big city and being able to just revel in that experience. So this is where Les finds himself in New York City. Can you read a bit from us and just, tell us about this section?
It's near the beginning, and he's in order to avoid this wedding invitation, he has accepted every half-baked invite in his inbox. And the first one is to interview a famous science fiction writer, H. Mandern, for which he feels underprepared. But he's in New York. And this is typical of him, that he's headed for disaster, but he thinks surely things will go better this time. New York is a city of 8 million people, approximately 7 million of whom will be furious when they hear you were in town and didn't meet them for an expensive dinner. 5 million furious you didn't visit their new baby. 3 million furious you didn't see their new show. 1 million furious you didn't call for sex, but only 5 actually available to meet you. It is completely reasonable to call none of them. You could instead sneak off to a terrible, treacly Broadway show that you will never admit you paid $200 to see. And this is what Les does on his first night, eating a hot dog dinner to make up for the extravagance. You cannot call it a guilty pleasure when the lights go down and the curtain goes up, when the adolescent heart starts to beat along with the orchestra, not when you feel no guilt. And he feels none. He feels only the shiver of delight when there is nobody around to judge you. It is a bad musical. But like a bad lay, a bad musical can still do its job perfectly well. By the end, Arthur Les is in tears, sobbing in his seat, and he thinks he has been sobbing quietly until the lights come up, and the woman seated beside him turns and says, "Honey, I don't know what happened in your life, but I am so sorry." And gives him a lilac-scented embrace. "Nothing happened to me," he wants to say to her. "Nothing happened to me. I'm just a homosexual at a Broadway show."
Andrew Sean Greer, everyone.
I love the display, the way you're natural for you.
I like to display in my. That sounded graphic, but you know what I mean. There is look. Les is also a queer novel, a gay novel, and I'm also wondering: is there something almost defiant, like politically defiant, about making it a happy novel?
Yes, I mean that was the idea. That well, it's two things, to be honest. One, I had tried for a long time, even with this book, as you see, to write a book with a gay protagonist that was going to be like a strong gay novel, and it kept veering towards tragedy. And I thought, I can't write that. I don't want another one of those in the world. There's some beautiful ones out there, and there's many others where we just keep killing ourselves, or not being able to keep. There's despair, and it's not what I see in many places, and I just wanted to sort of plant a flag of saying it is possible for two men to try to give love a chance, and for that to feel beautiful. You know?
I mean that canon, that body of LGBTIQ literature that is quite somber. That's understandable as well, though, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking Les, a little bit older than you in real life, but similar generation. You would have been teenagers when HIV/AIDS was kind of like coming up and everyone was starting to understand what it actually was to have sex and sexuality pathologized, and to see older men especially disappear. There is that kind of history that accounts for that literature.
Yeah, and I think accounts for why I could only write this right now when I feel like I saw there was a man in the audience in Byron Bay who he talked about what the book meant to him, and then I said, if I just would love to talk to my 20-year-old self and be like, can you even believe it? Like, who made it out? Who survived? And what we actually, like the world we have, like as crappy as it is, that we could be celebrated in some way. I would never have known. And we both were like, I wish we could email the past, because it didn't occur to us. You know, we were just fighting for our lives in some way. And so once I was able to, it's in the book a little bit, but in the sort of the past, the idea of having, and I also think, not to go on too long, there is a kind of a political tactic I remember from ACT UP and Queer Nation back in the 90s, which was to be defiant in a show of joy. like despite everything, to be joyful and funnier than the other side. And you would win that way because they were so humorless that your signs would be funnier and the media would go to your signs, you know? And it was true. It worked. We were funnier and more brightly colored and more joyous in the face of everything. And in the face of like real sorrow and struggles that go on today, it was a tactic. And that must have come through the years in me.
Yeah. One of the other pleasures of Less's itinerary. So let's just track through it. It's New York, Mexico City, Turin, Morocco, India. I think. Why these places? How did you plan that out right from the start?
No, it was it was the only places where I could get magazines to send me for articles. So like there's a big blank spot basically. Morocco to India is a long blank. And I'm like, I tried to get to Israel, honestly, just to kind of fill it in. But it didn't work out. I couldn't afford. I got invited on a tour, but I had to pay my own way, and there's no way. So.
But surely from now on, now that you've written this, all travel is tax deductible.
Well, it was tax deductible, but yeah. I mean, I just couldn't. So it's funny when I look at it, but I was insistent that he had to go around the world because I felt like the structure would be good for a reader. They would know when he was about to come home.
Yeah.
Because it's a circle.
And
I've heard.
Yeah.
But there's a secret chapter that I cut out.
Oh, there's like a hidden track to this novel?
There's a hidden track that you'll never read. And it wasn't very long before it was due that there was a whole chapter in Vietnam.
Oh, okay. And Vietnam, why Vietnam and why was it cut?
I went there for an article for United Airlines In-Flight magazine.
Okay.
And I pitched that in order for the novel, and
You're monstrously efficient with how you're using these trips. I love it.
I really. Well, you also if you travel alone, you're there alone with a notebook in like a restaurant. You take some notes about the restaurant for your magazine, and then you're like, and what else is there's like a dog they won't let into the dining room, and then they tries to go into the kitchen, they kick out of the kitchen, and it keeps sadly going back and forth, and you write down that detail.
And what was it about the Vietnam chapter that didn't pass your standards?
I loved the chapter, and there's things I missed about it, but it was structurally wrong. The pacing was off, and when I realized that there was a scene in it where he had a video call with his former lover, Robert Brownburn. And I thought, well, that's really the only thing that's happening in this chapter. I will put that in Japan, and then if I get rid of this chapter, there'll be a sort of, the pacing will be right for the novel.
Okay,
so
but you have a Vietnam apology tour coming up in your schedule, is it?
I guess so.
Hey, look, one of the sadder moments in this book is when Les is told by his agent that they won't be picking up his new book. And I expect readers of Les and anyone who's seen your success will just assume that, you've won the Pulitzer, this is a novel that's sold over 1 million copies all over the world. How would you possibly relate to that experience? But then recently I read in a feature article by my friend Greg Callahan for Good Weekend magazine that while writing Les, you felt your career was on the skids, and that you were stranded on the rocks of middle age. That was a quote. Is that really true?
Yeah.
What was going on?
Well, I mean, you can even look, there are books for sale afterwards, and if you look at them, you will see that my backlist is published by Faber, and then my new book is published by Hachette, because Faber published 4 books of mine, and then said, you don't sell, we can't buy any more books from you. And that's part of being a middle-aged writer. That happens. Like you write enough books to prove that no one wants to read you. Debut, they're like, you're going to be amazing. It'll be great. But by 4 or 5 books, like, what are you going to do?
Because everyone loves like a splashy debut novel,
They do.
Right? And so, what are your next steps from there? Because that sounds shattering. Do you write you write a Pulitzer Prize winning novel and have the ultimate mic drop?
I wish I could have filmed walking into the Pulitzer ceremony and seeing my former editor who turned down my book. And being like, Jonathan, how great to see you.
Several authors in the audience
There's-
just came hearing
no.
that story.
I think, you have to relish those moments because that's you're just like, it's the plot that
When you're having a bad day, do you just like go back to that moment now over and over again? I would.
Jonathan. Mwah. I'm not that bitter a
No.
person, but it was, yeah.
That person no longer works in publishing. So the Pulitzer Prize, let's talk about that because and also thank you for giving us the pronunciation of the prize in the book. It's
How would you know? Yeah.
Pulitzer, which feels right.
That is from their
Pulitzer.
website, ladies and gentlemen.
So the prize features heavily in the novel itself. What was your idea of the Pulitzer before you even won it?
Someone does win the Pulitzer Prize in the book, and I gave it to an older, well-established, famous, beloved poet, Robert Brownburn, and even he is shaking with shock at hearing the news, because to me, it would be the most impossible thing that would happen to anyone.
So that's his moment in the book. What was the real-life moment for you?
I had just finished putting an incontinent pug into diapers.
That's glamorous.
At a writer's retreat in Tuscany.
Is this even your pug?
No, it was the Baroness's pug. And I had to train the pug to wear diapers because Margaret Atwood was coming soon. And we had to class up the place. Did that scan at all, that story? Did I just sketch out a universe of weirdness that I was
There are just
living
so
in?
many
Yeah, right.
post-it notes that make up one story that are just clashing all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Margaret Atwood and dog feces. That's
Yeah.
just very, very strange.
Actually, she would have dealt with it really well. She's a very practical woman. It
Okay,
turned
so
out,
what?
yeah.
You got the call. You get an email.
I got that wrong in the novel. You don't get a call.
Oh.
You don't get a call that it's wrong. Or maybe it was right when the novel's set. My boyfriend Enrico showed me his phone, which said, someone had texted him the San Francisco Chronicle that said Sean Greer wins Pulitzer Prize.
Wow, wait. So other people have found out before you even do. You don't even get... That seems rude,
No, it had been
kind of.
hours. It had been announced hours before, and
Okay.
we were in rural Tuscany doing some other things, and we're not looking at our phones, and of course I didn't know the Pulitzer Prizes were being announced. I didn't know anything like that. I was in a different world. I was, watering down the wine for the writers, that kind of thing.
And then what happens next? How do you celebrate?
The real wine. The real wine. I knew where it was in the basement. I got very, very drunk. Very drunk that night.
Now that you've won it, what has changed and what hasn't?
I left the job with the Baronessa, mostly because it was too time-consuming, and I realized that I had a chance to be a writer, and
I think that would surprise some people. Like, you were already like a multiple published author, and you weren't a completely full-time writer before Les won the Pulitzer?
No, I mean, I was, and then there was no more money.
Right.
And so then I took a job, like this really wonderful job as director of an artist residency. But it was full on. It was calling the plumber in Italian kind of stuff. And we have a former resident, Abigail Ullman, here, who can back up any story I have about bats in the tower, which were a problem. Yeah, I'm sorry to diverge a moment, but I came into the tower once to find Abby and Ethiopian-American writer Maza Mengistu sitting there with plastic bags over their hair, screaming, "There's a bat, there's a bat."
Okay, so when you hear the phrase writer's retreat in Tuscany, it sounds so idyllic and gorgeous, but there are a lot of animals and horror going on, it sounds like.
And we would try to, and I had to take care of it, because if we reported it to the Baronessa, she would say, "Country living."
Okay.
That's it. I got it to fly out. I had a big broom, and I got it to go from the top of the tower all the way out. And actually, the moment it flew out, her assistant, Nico, appeared at the door, and we screamed, "Vampire!"
So there are some fundamental things that have changed. You don't no longer need to deal with bats and the viruses that they carry.
I have a couple years of doing this sort of gorgeous thing, and then also being able to sit and just commit to my writing and work on a new book. You know what the nicest thing is that I've always, I don't know, I've felt anxiety around other writers and feeling like, do I have the right to go up and talk to this writer who's so famous? Or like...
But a lot of your friends are super famous writers as well. Like, you're best friends with Daniel Handler, you know Dave Eggers, you know Margaret Atwood. You can just drop her in conversation while you're changing a pug diaper. Joyce Carol Oates, Amy Tan. I could go... I know your community. I've read about it.
But I always felt... It's like a sort of, I was going to say handmade, but that's from Margaret Atwood, isn't it? You know, I think I always felt like it was so nice of them to hang out with me. Like, I must be a really, nice to hang out with. And then after winning the Pulitzer Prize, I was like, well, I don't have to be anxious about that anymore. And not in some conceited way, but I was like, I can walk up to George Saunders, like I did in Sydney, and just talk with him like a normal person without being filled with weirdness.
You really didn't feel you could do that?
No.
Prior?
No, I didn't. And he came to my reading in Santa Cruz because he's so generous, you know. So that was the biggest change, was to feel. I can't tell you how many other Pulitzer Prize winners wrote to me, congratulating me.
Can you so name drop and tell us who wrote to you and what did they say?
Well, Michael Chabon called me, and Michael Cunningham called me, and Colin Toy-Bean, he didn't win the Pulitzer Prize, but he called me, I'll just drop it. And Donna Tartt wrote me, and Jeffrey Eugenides, who I had run into a year before in Italy at an airport, and I said, "Mr. Eugenides, you don't know me, but we met a few years ago." And he said, "Andy, we know each other. Why are you acting weird?" And he wrote to me and he said, "Remember how you thought I didn't know who you were? Now everyone will know who you are." I mean, that's how weird I was. I was like, I don't want him to feel weird that he should remember me. But he was like, we went to a drag club in New York. How could I not remember that?
I mean, I feel so relieved for you that you have that burden kind of lifted off of your shoulders. But for anyone who's read your books previous to Less, which is so gorgeous, I just finished reading The Impossible Lives of Greta Wells, which is such a beautiful book, and I just want to buy the stage rights off you if I can. I'm just going to announce that now. The Confessions of Max Tivoli. These were not insignificant books. They were quite big. People know these books. And what accounts for that? I mean, now that you're on the other side of it, looking back, what accounts for that imposter syndrome? And it just makes me think, does it ever go away? Do we all have to win the Pulitzer Prize to get rid of it?
That is what you have to do. It totally works. It works. I mean, what accounts for it is that it's such a weird career we're in, where if we're pure about it, we're writing these books and we're not paying too much attention. We love it when people read them, and if they don't, then writers often admire us a lot for books that readers don't really love. And so you meet other writers and they say, "I loved your book," and you talk about other books you loved, and it feels really natural. Unfortunately, at least in the United States, there is a feeling of that there's some sort of hierarchy of the writers, and I hate it. I hate thinking about that. Luckily, on the West Coast, it doesn't exactly exist in the same way. And I came into San Francisco with all these other writers, Michael Chabon and Dave Eggers and Daniel Handler. And we went to parties at Amy Tan's house with Armistead Maupin. And I just was the not famous one. You know, I was like, they were so lovely, they were so generous, and Khaled Hosseini and all these wonderful writers, this wonderful, generous world, and I was like, I'm in here, I just, you know, I'm the weird, like, extra character, for, you know, because they were all famous when I met them.
Yeah.
And it just seemed normal to me that would be the setup, you know?
You know, when you read about Les online, one of the things I really enjoy is reading what book clubs have assigned as questions about a text.
You looked at that?
Yeah.
Wow.
Have you looked at the New York Times, what they do? So they chose your book for some kind of online book club, and they have these set questions. And one of the questions they encourage readers to ask each other at the book club is, what is love? And I think that's a great and valid question. And it's now one I want to throw to you. Now that you've read less, I mean, you know, we can go to the source material. Let's let's just skip over the book clubs. If book clubs want the answer, we've got the source right here. Andrew Sean Greer, now that you've written this book about love, what is love?
It's Pulitzer Prize. No, I mean, you know, I have to say that to me, it's, in a way, it's smart because it's the essential question of the book. And it's sort of buried, not so much buried, in a speech that a character, Zora, gives, where she's impassioned and enraged about what's happened in her own life. And I wrote it because I don't know. But that's why we write the things, because we don't know. And I find somehow people turning to me and expecting me to be an expert on romance or something. Whereas I'm present for the conversation. You know, I don't shy away from it at all. I'm interested. It's the only interesting topic to me. And there's another part in the book that where Arthur Less is telling someone that he has a dream, and he says first, don't worry, you're not in it. I'm not going to remember it correctly. It's been a year and a half since I published this damn book. But it's like I woke up and I thought, I'm through with love. I'm ready for better things. And he gets off on like a horse and he crosses a river, and there's like a ferryman on the river, and he says, good for you, you're ready for better things. And he, you know, puts his horse in a stable, and the man says, you're ready for better things. And he climbs up the mountain, he finds the old wise man, and he says, I am here, I am ready for better things. And the old man says, better than what? He says, more important than love. And the old man says, what could be more important than love? And that is how I feel. Yeah.
We're going to get the audience involved very, very soon. But before we throw to the audience, Andrew, I want to ask you, you know, for the last couple of years since this book has come out, so many of us have been passing it on to our friends, sometimes aggressively and with violence, just saying, you must read this. And it probably accounts for how well the book has done, as well as the Pulitzer Prize. And I'm wondering what have been those books for you over the last few years, the ones that you've been thrusting into everyone's hands?
Oh, man. A lot of them turn out to be books by friends because you watch them struggle and you think they're never going to do it. And then you...
Thank you for the snort, whoever that was.
And then you get it in your hands and you think, I can't believe they had this in them all that time. And they're life-changing books. I'm handing everyone, there's a book that came out in the US, it won't be out here yet, a book called The Flight Portfolio by a writer, Julie Oringer, that is this huge book she's been researching for 10 years about an American gay man who went to occupied France with a certain amount of funding to choose which artists he could get out of occupied France before it was, and he had to choose how good they were.
Wow.
Artists would make sketches to prove they were good enough to get on the boat.
Oh. What's that book called
The
again?
The Flight Portfolio. Because that was the name of the portfolio he sent to funders to prove that he needed more money. And it's true, and it's incredible. So that's the one I'm pushing. Okay. And I've got another one by Maza Mengistu, who was the Parade of the Bats, that I just read, called The Shadow King, about the Italian occupation of Ethiopia, which is a story I just feel like we haven't heard about at all. And it's extraordinary. Extraordinary.
Fantastic. Thank you. Hello.
Hello, thank you. Has your relationship with your twin changed since you won the Pulitzer?
Oh, wow.
So you're an identical twin.
I am.
Me too.
Oh, you are too?
Yes.
Okay, now you can talk more frankly.
Yeah. We have a great relationship. We had some sort of like a little friction when our lives started to change a little bit, that like he got married and had kids, and so our lives were not synced up anymore, and that's hard for me. Each of us to watch the other doing and having a life they wouldn't normally have, that I wouldn't have. And he was overjoyed. We had Thanksgiving at my house, which is, I'm sure you've heard of this American holiday, and the thing that you think couldn't possibly be true is we sit around the table and we each say what we're thankful for that year. And I thought, well, it's a big political time. I'm going to talk about important female political figures in America who are making a big difference. And everyone, I said Stacey Abrams and people like that. And then it went around the table and my brother said, I'm thankful that Andy won the Pulitzer Prize. And my 9-year-old nephew said, I'm grateful Uncle Andy won the Pulitzer Prize. And my 5-year-old nephew said, and around the whole table they all went. Yeah, my brother was so excited. Yeah. But as a twin, it's, can feel like a competition, but then also it feels like it's happening to you in some way, so.
Thank you so much for your question. We've got another question here from Stephen Russell.
Hello, Stephen Russell.
And I also was the person that snorted. Sorry about that. One of the things, when you won this award, Andrew, and I love this book so much, but I felt like it was a real 1-2 punch in the sense that not only was it a queer novel that won, an incredible prize at this level, but it was also a comic novel, and so few comic novels win something like this. So it felt like a blow against snobbery as well. And I wonder, was that something that sort of struck your mind about how unlikely it is for a novel like this to be celebrated rightfully in this way?
What a lovely thing to say. Yeah, I mean, it was all so shocking and was still a little shocking, but it is true. It's very unusual for comic novels to at least in the United States, get celebrated. And yet, I think that for a lot of us, while we read widely and read these important books that are full of the tragedy of the world, often the one we cling closely to and reread secretly are those books that make us sort of fill us with joy in some way, like you turn to them because you need them. So if I could think that would be that for some people, I would be like, oh, nailed it, Who knows? A comic novel hasn't won the Pulitzer Prize in maybe 35 years since Confederacy of Dunces, but I know Confederacy of Dunces in the United States is a book a lot of young people have as their favorite book. So that was charming too.
Any more questions for the mic there? Yes, we've got one here.
Hello. We almost share a birthday. I'm one day after you or something.
You're the 22nd of November?
Oh, I thought you were the 5th of November.
Oh. You can sit down now. No, I'm just kidding. What's your question?
I wasn't going to ask about the birthday.
Oh, dear.
I wanted to know, you've obviously done a lot of media and a lot of in conversations. Is there been one question that you've been really hoping someone would ask that hasn't been asked yet?
Oh, geez.
Wow. I mean, I thought this whole night was a waste of time until you came along. I don't know. I always think, because I've been in Ben's shoes a lot, asking the questions of a writer. And it's tough because when you're a fellow writer, what you kind of want to write is how. How did you do it? Where did it come from? Which you could see he also wants to get from me. And you can almost never get it because you don't know how. And if someone could figure out the question for me or any writer where you actually like somehow unstoppered that special, like how art happens, how something comes from a bunch of terrible notes on a novel into something that you're proud of, that would be great. But I can never figure out that question when I'm asking someone.
Thank you so much for your question. In another session, Andrew just really wanted to talk about his full sexual and medical history, but we had to stop him from doing that this session, so that was a question he really wanted to be asked. We've got a question over here.
Mine was about your full sexual and medical history. Starting with those pants. Thank you for coming to Melbourne. My question was actually, because you said that now winning the Pulitzer allows you a few years to focus on writing, does that change your writing habit? Because you don't have to do it around other work that pays the bills. Has that so far changed any process for you?
Yeah, and it takes a little adjusting because there is something good about having a duty every day that forces you to like cram in those hours in the morning. I remember being really young as a writer and having a job, and I would just, I would type away on my computer in my free hours all the time because it's all I had. And now that I have more expansive hours, although lots of emails to answer, which is a terrible problem, I have to come up with the solid habit that isn't just sitting at home and waiting for things to come. But luckily, I have a best friend, Daniel Handler, who is the hardest worker I know and a bit of a genius. And so I go swimming with him every morning, and I sit in a cafe with him and work beside him, where he sits with a yellow legal pad and just flips page after page next to me as I'm sitting and thinking. And it forces me into the same mode of like, he's going to get hungry at one point, and then we finish writing. I better finish my pages. So I still need that fire.
Thank you for your question. There's another one coming up at that same microphone.
Yes, please. Thank you very much. I'm just staggered to hear that Sherry was in your head, having read Sherry, and it's a much bleaker novel, I would suggest.
It is, yeah. And the sequel is even more bleak.
Exactly. But I loved the joyousness of the novel. I'm just, mine's a bit prosaic, my question. Who was in your head? Who is the famous poet? I had Robert Lovell in my head when you...
What a good question about Robert Brownburn. Frank O'Hara was sort of the one in my head. He's from a different era, but I'd been in love with his poetry, and then he had a friend, sometime lover, I'm forgetting his name, Jimmy Schuyler, whose poetry I also love, that was very different. And I have a photograph of the two of them on my mantle at home that Daniel Handler, for my 40th birthday, contacted a friend of theirs and said, do you happen to have any photos lying around? He said, I have all these rolls of undeveloped film of all these poets and writers. And so Daniel had them developed for this man because they're of historical importance, and he sent me one. Isn't that, yeah.
Thank you so much for your question. Yes, hello. One over there.
Actors tend to say that they never watch their work, so they never watch themselves on film. Are authors like that too? Would you sit down and read your book?
Do you do that?
What did Zadie Smith once write? That to read any past work is to induce nausea?
Yeah, no, I never do. I never do. I did once. I reread my first novel for some reason, and it made me want to rewrite the last part of the pages. And I wrote to my agent, and she said, no.
Have you ever had to narrate your audiobooks?
No, I haven't done that.
I don't recommend it.
Oh, man.
Similar reasons.
Similar feeling of like cringing.
Yes, it's deeply exposing. Got a question there. Hello.
Yeah, hi. You made the point that you wanted to write a different kind of queer novel, and as we've also seen that queer spaces are changing as homosexuality and trans culture are becoming celebrated, I wonder what you see as the future for queer literature as well.
No one's ever asked me that.
That's the question.
Wow. oddly, I would see it becoming strangely diffuse as sort of, when I was in 1988 came out, there was gay, lesbian, people were mean about bisexual, and that was it. And those categories have become not very useful, I think. And I would be so interested in a future of literature where all of that becomes this fluidity about gender and sexuality, which, with a feeling of celebration about it, which would feel like it would connect and talk about all people, which is what actually the queer revolution I remember being about, was about sexual freedom for all people.
Thank you so much for your question. I mean, just building on that great question, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of think like if Less had come out in a different time, it would be stocked specifically in that LGBTI section. And obviously, if there is an LGBTI section in a bookshop, I think you'd find it there, but you'd also find it in the main fiction category. Like, do you find that kind of breaking down as time goes on, where you find a book like Less?
I mean, my first novel you could only find in the gay and
Really?
lesbian section is what it was called then. I remember going to bookstores and moving it to the general fiction section because it wasn't even that gay.
Yeah.
And not very lesbian.
That's your next
But
novel.
I mean, I know what that section's for, of course, because especially at that time when there was no online presence, people would go there searching for something that in the general fiction you just couldn't tell, because in my day you had to go through books looking for the letter X in it somewhere, and you would be like homosexual, and then you would be able to find it. And so at least that was for a purpose, but I didn't love just being there, and then only being reviewed by Frontiers magazine, which was the kind of magazine that in gay bars they put out telling you all the like leather Sunday events that are coming up, and then book reviews too.
Yeah.
Like
with all respect to Frontiers magazine,
absolutely an amazing magazine, and it was a very sophisticated review too.
Yeah. Any more questions from the audience? If not, I've just got two more questions for you from me. I'm just going to be selfish. A lot of your books are quite filmic, and I think they could be staged. And I'm just wondering, are we going to see Less anywhere? Are we going to see? I mean, the Confessions of Max Tivoli, I think I read, was kind of jettisoned by The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. Is that right?
It was. Yeah.
Bullshit, but it's bullshit. But what about your other works?
How lovely of you to ask. Some of them I can't quite talk about.
Okay.
I can't talk about, but it's been interesting to see that the world of Hollywood has changed enough that novels like Story of a Marriage, which has the major characters are African American, it's possible for that film to be made by an African American producing company in the United States, which it didn't exist 5 years ago.
In an ideal world, who would be in that?
Oh my word! Gosh, who knows? I'm no good at that. I'm no good at casting. People ask me who should play Arthur Less, and I'm like, Daniel Craig. He's great. And they're like, what? I'm like, no, I'm sure he could do it. He'd love it. It's a stretch. And they're like, you're crazy. I'm like, yeah, call up Daniel Craig. He'll say yes.
Okay. He's gonna be.
I'm terrible at this.
And look, the second question I'm kind of nervous to ask, because it's kind of like asking someone who's just given birth, like, when are you going to have a baby next? But I feel like I'd be negligent to the audience if I didn't ask what we all wanted to know. Do you have an idea of what comes after Less?
Yeah, luckily I have had time to start work on a new book and fail at it and have a nervous breakdown. And I'm still in that stage.
Okay.
But it's good news. It's along the path of production.
The breakthrough will come in swimming.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Hey, thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you, Ben.
Not just in Melbourne, but in all of Australia. You've done like 4 different cities in 10 days.
Yeah.
It's very Lessian of you. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Safe travels back home. Could you please join me in thanking our wonderful guest tonight, Sean Greer, everyone.
And Benjamin Law.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.